Well, greetings, everyone, and welcome to the Harvard Catholic Forum. I am Deacon Tim O'Donnell, Executive Director of the Forum, and I'm delighted to welcome you both here at St. Paul's campus in Harvard Square and on the live stream to this year's 7th annual Daniel Harrington S.J. Memorial Lecture, a series devoted to themes from the study of Scripture. Let me begin with a brief word about the Harvard Catholic Forum. Our mission is to share the riches of Catholic thought and culture through lectures, non-credit courses, master classes, reading groups, and other programs, both to the university community and to the wider public. Check out our website at harvardcatholicforum.org, where you can sign up for our newsletters, register for future events, and please support our important mission by making a financial contribution. All of our programs are given free of charge, but they are not free to put on, so please help us. We depend on your contributions of any size. Tonight's event will be archived on the Harvard Catholic Forum YouTube channel. If you like what you see and hear, please share the link to that channel with others. We always have more views on the archive than on day one. I might mention that our lecture by Bishop Barron 3.5 weeks ago already has 26,000 views on the Harvard Catholic Forum YouTube channel. Tonight's lecture honors the memory of Father Dan Harrington, S.J., a model scholar, teacher, and priest whose life and work exemplified all that is at best in the Catholic engagement with the sacred page. His publications ranged from highly technical work with texts and languages to scholarly articles and monographs, but also included books and magazine articles and commentaries that with unmatched clarity plumbed the depths of the Bible for a general audience. After completing his PhD in Near Eastern languages here at Harvard, he was a professor first at the Weston Jesuit School of Theology in Cambridge, and then at its successor, the Boston College School of Theology and Ministry, where he profoundly influenced students from all over the world as a teacher and mentor. And finally this, many of us also knew Father Dan as a priest, a preacher, and a pastoral presence. In particular, every Sunday, for nearly 20 years, he celebrated the noon Mass at St. Peter's here in Cambridge. So tonight, we are able to honor his memory by having as co-sponsors the Boston College School of Theology and Ministry and St. Peter's Parish in Cambridge. We also welcome Father Dan's brother Ed and his wife Marilyn on Zoom. And finally, this event is made possible through the support of the John Templeton Foundation through its grant in Lumine, promoting the Catholic intellectual tradition at campuses nationwide. So let me give you a roadmap of tonight's event. The lecture segment will last 35 minutes or so, and then we will have an opportunity for some Q&A. Those of you who are here in person should have received a note card and a pencil when you came in. If you have a question, please write it on the card. And shortly after 6 o'clock, some of my colleagues will come up the aisles and collect the cards and bring them to me. I will pass on as many questions as I can. Unfortunately, we are unable to take questions from the live stream audience today. The lecture this evening will refer to some texts printed on a handout that our in-person audience should have received on entering. If anyone is missing it, please put your hand up and someone will bring it to you. For Zoom participants, you can also find the PDF next to the registration on harvardcatholicforum.org, and also, I believe, as an attachment in the chat box. And here's something important. Please help us to evaluate and improve our programs by filling out our 2-minute survey after the program tonight. You who are here should have a paper survey you can complete with a pencil and drop in one of the baskets as you leave. Zoom participants will get an online version, which again only takes a couple of minutes to click through. Thank you so much for your help on this. And finally, please stay and join us for a reception right here in DiGiovanni Hall right after the lecture. Tonight's lecturer hardly needs an introduction, so I will be brief. Gary Anderson is the Hesburgh Professor of Catholic Thought at the University of Notre Dame and an internationally recognized scholar on the Old Testament, early Judaism and Christianity, and the theological themes in the Scriptural tradition. A past president of the Catholic Biblical Association, he was professor of Old Testament here at Harvard Divinity School before moving to Notre Dame. Professor Anderson is the author or editor of more than 10 books, including the award winners Charity, The Place of the Poor in the Biblical Tradition, Sin, A History, and Christian Doctrine and the Old Testament. He has also written for The Christian Century, First Things, Commonweal, and America. His PhD is from Harvard. So, welcome back, and please join me in welcoming Gary Anderson.
It's very much a pleasure to be here. As it was mentioned, I got my PhD, studied a student here from 1981 to 85, and my family lived in Peabody Terrace, not too far that way. And I remember my classes were up at the Semitic Museum, which is close to the William James Building, the Divinity School, if you know that. And so I walked through this parking lot every morning on my way. None of this was built. I remember the choir school kids played basketball out there with a basketball net. Little did I know that, when I came back here as a faculty member, my youngest son would be a part of the choir school. So I had a very different relationship to St. Paul's then. Also, I like to characterize my 2 long stays in the Boston area by the big building projects that consumed the area then. When we were here from 81 to 85, they were extending the Red Line from Cambridge north and west. And Harvard Square was like a big hole, like a bomb had gone off there. It was so ugly and atrocious the whole time I was there. And then when I was here from 95 to 2003, that was the Big Dig, which was a nightmare of another sort. So I've never lived in Boston when the transportation, worked properly. Anyways, and maybe as a testimony to that, my wife and I, when we got out at the airport today, we went over to the Uber station to pick up a cab and clocked it into my iPhone, and the price was $120. I thought, my God, that's almost the plane trip from South Bend to Boston. It's going to be $120 from Logan Airport to Cambridge. So we hiked down to the taxi stand and got a ride for $45. Okay, so enough non-important information. On to the topic for today. Basically, what we're going to do in the lecture today is to go through the handout and illustrate how these texts shape the way in which the early church and synagogue understood the virtue of charity and practiced it. I remember one time after I had given a lecture on the subject of charity, a learned priest told me about a question a parishioner had posed to him after he had preached on the story of the rich young man. In case you've forgotten, this is a story in which a man runs up to Jesus and asks him what he must do to attain eternal life. Jesus quizzes him as to whether he has kept a group of commandments, to which the man responds, "I've done those." Jesus then demands that he go and sell all that he owns, give the proceeds to the poor in order to attain a treasure in heaven, and we can presume then enjoy eternal life. The passage raised a question in the parishioner's mind. He asked the priest, why did Jesus include that clause, "You'll have treasure in heaven"? Shouldn't Jesus simply have said, "Go sell what you own and give the money to the poor"? Full stop. By appending this motivational clause, a necessary condition for an action being moral seemed to be fatally compromised. A charitable deed, this man presumed, ought to be grounded solely in a concern for the other and not spoiled by any scent of self-interest. Now, on the face of it, this is a difficult question, and the concern for selfless acts of charity has been at the heart of both Jewish and Christian thinking from the very beginning. But somewhat surprisingly, this particular text, that is the story of the rich young man, did not register any such anxiety among our earliest Christian readers. In fact, quite the opposite. For these readers, this was one of the most important concepts that Jesus spoke about. Yet the concept of a heavenly treasury certainly has been something of an embarrassment for modern persons. And I think it's fair to say that the concept of a treasury in heaven marks the difference between the way in which ancient and modern minds conceive of the significance of the charitable deed. If you wanted to see this illustrated quite nicely, take a look at the third page of your handout. I have a quote from two modern scholars here. Peter Brown, some of you might know, is the great historian of late antiquity, Princeton University, now retired, just wrote a fantastic book, some 700 or 800 pages concerning his life story, a well-received biography, autobiography. Wrote in his early days a book on Augustine that still is in print, still is the best book on Augustine. This was one of his last subjects as an active researching scholar, the notion and the way in which the churches in the late antique period, Latin churches especially, practiced charity. So in his book, Eye of the Needle, he says this: in some way or another, to give within the Christian churches was to open a path to heaven. With vertiginous incongruity, any Christian gift from the smallest to the greatest was thought to be instantly magnified out of all proportion in another world. It became, quote, treasure in heaven. This was the conclusion that preachers drew insistently from the story of the rich young man. In this story, Christ said to that man, sell what you possess, give to the poor, you'll have treasure in heaven. And then he repeats something similar in Luke. Late Roman Christians of all classes and levels of culture took these sayings of Jesus seriously. They seemed to imply a joining of heaven and earth that a non-Christian would have perceived as utterly incongruous. Very important sentence that we'll see nicely illustrated in a midrash on page 2, a piece of Jewish tradition on page 2, but we'll get to that soon enough. We should linger on the novelty of this attitude to the joining of heaven with earthly wealth. It is one that in many ways is strange to us. Indeed, it has caused exquisite embarrassment to modern scholars. Here's a very important sentence. In no modern dictionary, what he means by this is scholars produce dictionaries or handbooks that illustrate significant topics in the area of study they work in. There's a zillion of them. Publishers love these things because every library is going to buy them no matter what they charge, and it's instant success. But what a handbook is supposed to do is to orient the reader to the historical concerns of an area obviously different than ours. So a responsible handbook trying to articulate what was important to late antique Christians, Brown's arguing, certainly would have an entry on treasury in heaven. For those writers, this was one of the most important theological concepts imaginable. And Brown notes the incredible irony that among Catholic, Jewish, and Protestant handbooks, German, French, English, all of them, he's surveyed them, he's a linguistic polyglot, no entry. Quite striking. Yet if we wish, Brown continues to understand the economic upsurge of Christian churches at this time, it's important that we overcome a prudery no late Roman Christian would have shared. And then to illustrate this, Patrick Miller is going to be, in a sense, my fall man here. That's unfortunate because he's a great scholar. He's since passed away, a great man, great Christian man, as well as an excellent scholar of the Hebrew Bible. But he illustrates nicely this tendency, which I could have brought innumerable sources to indicate this, of a modern scholar ignoring altogether the notion of a treasury in heaven. Here he's simply summarizing, paraphrasing this teaching of Jesus, and notice what he says. He says, Jesus' words to the young man, go and sell all he has and give the money to the poor, and then come and follow me, joins together release from the grip of desire to have and the true object of uncontrolled, extravagant desire. Well, that's all true, but notice what he's left out. He tells us what Jesus says in that story, but he leaves out treasure in heaven. Obviously, he thinks that's an element that's not important, and as well reflects something of an embarrassment, illustrating exactly Peter Brown's thesis. You can see why there's no dictionary that has an entry on the concept, because the concept itself is thought to be of negligible value. One of the reasons that modern readers, going back to my point here about altruism and this parishioner who took umbrage at the notion that Jesus would add this to his teaching, one of the reasons modern readers are drawn to the altruistic motives of the rich young man is that we view charity in a strictly horizontal fashion, as if the only players to be considered in the charitable act are the donor and the donee. On this view, two concerns rise to a center stage: the motivations of the donor and the effectiveness of the donation. The latter concern raises the important question of how our charitable efforts contribute to the creation of a more just society, an extremely important dimension in modern discourse about poverty. But oftentimes, this has led to the folding of charity in both religious and secular discourse into concerns for social justice without remainder. I can illustrate this again here from another direction. The very last page you have here is a painting. Oh, I didn't put the illustration in here. Joachim and the Beggars. I saw this when I was participating. Oh, I better not move from the mic here. If I move from the mic, all of our Zoom participants will lose. Right, okay. I like to walk around, so I'm going to have to control myself here. All right. I was participating in the March for Life in Washington, and in the time leading up to that, I love to go to art museums and look at the Byzantine, Renaissance, early modern paintings and try to determine from the biblical scenes how they've understood the Bible in order to render the picture the way they do. And whoever was responsible for labeling this picture, it's 13th or 14th century, and I forget the artist, but it's in my book. I highly recommend buying it if you want the full information about it. I always like to say, don't read the book, but be sure you buy it. But in this instance, anyways, it was titled Joachim and the Beggars. It's a depiction of Joachim and Anna, the traditional parents of the Blessed Virgin Mary. And if you look here on the left, you'll see Joachim giving bread, it appears, to beggars who are beside him, and to his right, our left. But equally important for this painting is the depiction of Anna, who's joined to Joachim, certainly not by accident, joined at the hip, we might want to say in an English idiom. I think to depict what the artist wants to depict is that they are, as it were, a single actor. One pointed one way, one pointed the other, but essentially doing the same thing. And what is Anna doing? She's giving a gift, perhaps a tithe, to the priest. And what this painting nicely illustrates is the organic unity of gifts to the poor and gifts to the altar, gifts to the church, nicely illustrating that charity isn't simply a secular horizontal affair, but it involves God as well. I should emphasize that my point here is by no means to impugn social justice. Far from it. Social justice is primarily concerned with the equitable distribution of finite goods in this world. As a result, it cannot, on its own, capture this crucial sacramental role charity provides or plays in the Bible. Charity, I wish to contend this afternoon, early evening, hard to know what to call this time of day, must be understood along both horizontal and vertical axes. It is this vertical dimension, I want to suggest, that's fallen out of our theological imagination and constitutes the major reason why Jesus' motivational clause to the rich man has become such a stumbling block. In order to appreciate why charity has this vertical dimension, it'd be useful to look again at the origins of this concept in the Jewish scriptures. Perhaps a closer reading of these texts can restore some vigor to a dimension of our theological imagination that is greatly atrophied. Okay, so let's take a look at our text here. They divide really into two groups. The first group revolves around a proverb, Proverb 10:2, that's going to inform, well, I'm moving away from the mic here, that's going to inform what we will find in the book of Tobit and later in the Gospel of Luke. And then the second set of texts proceeds from the teaching, again, of another proverb in 1917, and the way that teaching influences what we'll find in Ben Sira, a Jewish midrash meaning a Jewish interpretation of the Bible, and ultimately a patristic, that is, early Christian homily. So that's what we're going to do. The first three texts illustrate the Bible's ideas of how you should invest for the future. I'd love to see someone in HR use this material to guide employees as to where to put their money. It'd be very foolish to follow the advice here. That's going to be part of the point, but we'll see. And then the second set of texts 4, 5, and beyond, are going to deal with the important notion of reciprocity and our obligation to our neighbor. Okay, so let's begin. I have two translations here of Proverbs, and this is because it's one issue to ask the question, what did this proverb mean in the moment in which it was composed? But it's a very different question to say, how was this proverb understood in Jesus' day, or in the century or two prior to the arrival of Jesus, such as the book of Tobit. And all languages' meanings, change in time. I remember one of my favorite examples of this comes from a book by a great biblical scholar, John Barton, who mentions that someone describes St. Paul's in London, I think in the 19th century, as awful and artificial. But awful's a funny word because you think of the suffix full. You have joyful, someone's full of joy, mirthful, whatever. What are some other words with full? Grateful, wonderful. Well, awful should be full of awe, which in fact what it used to mean, but it changed. The word changed dramatically. And the same with artificial. So frequently when you read Shakespeare, for example, you'll need an annotated text, not only for the words that you don't know, of which there are many, but often for the words you think you know, because the words you think you know are often much more problematic because you are fooled by your knowledge of English and miss what Shakespeare's trying to say. So we have that in Proverbs as well, especially this word for righteousness, which I have crossed out because that word comes to mean almsgiving in Second Temple Judaism and into the New Testament and up to the present day in Judaism. And that's going to change the way this proverb is heard. So the very first citation of this proverb, treasures of wickedness provide no benefit, but almsgiving or righteousness delivers from death, is what it originally was. But once we put almsgiving in there, the proverb is going to change its nuance and meaning considerably. And we can see that change illustrated very nicely in the book of Tobit, which is text number 2. Here Tobit is making his last set of instructions to his son Tobias before he thinks he's going to die. And very important for Tobit is to teach his son to give to the poor. It's the most important of all commandments for Tobit. He says, do not turn your face from the poor, and the face of God will be not turned away from you. If you have many possessions, make your gift from them in proportion. If few, do not be afraid to give according to the little you have. And here's our first reference, or among the first, to our treasury in heaven, here called a good treasury. You'll be laying up a good treasury for yourself against the day of necessity. This is like a rainy day fund when things go bad in the future. If you give money to the poor, you will be amassing a treasury that you can draw on. And then the verse from Proverbs, how does Tobit know this? The Bible tells him so. Almsgiving, he says, will deliver from death and keep you from going into darkness. Now what's interesting here, and why I have the last two lines in italics, is you would think that good treasure perhaps is not derived from the proverb, that Tobit here has made that up, extended that beyond the proverb. But it's not hard to see how that notion of a good treasury or a treasury in heaven could be teased out of this proverb. In biblical poetry, frequently the second line is elliptical and presumes that we bring down a word from the first line to achieve full understanding. So the first line here tells us that treasures of wickedness provide no benefit. It would be very easy for a reader in this period to presume that, well, treasures of wickedness are of no value. Treasures funded by alms will be of ultimate value. They will deliver from death. And I would suggest that's what informs our second text here. The text from Tobit is not only is he citing word for word what we have in Proverbs 10:2, but he's involved in a what we call exegetical extension, a interpretive extension of that verse in order to create and drive this notion there's not only treasures of wickedness, but there are good or heavenly treasuries that we fund not by hoarding, but we fund by generosity. And it's precisely this idea that I think serves as the spinal column, we might want to say, of Jesus' teaching in the parable of the rich fool in Luke. There we read, the land of a rich man produced abundantly, and he thought to himself, what should I do, for I have no place to store my crops? Then he said, I will do this. I'll pull down my barns and build larger ones, and store all my grain and my goods. And here's where the error enters. And I will say to my soul, soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, and be merry. So what grounds his satisfaction? He's been the beneficiary, presumably, of a divine gift, an incredible agricultural bounty. What does he do upon receipt of said gift? He thinks his future now is worry-free because, like Bill Gates or whomever, he's got billions that he'll never be able to spend, right? He can now rest assured and live off the profits he's amassed. But that goes against the grain of Proverbs. Treasures of wickedness, what does that mean? It's kind of colorless, we might want to say genitive, but in this period, this was understood as treasures accumulated by hoarding money. And the proverb teaches that hoarding your wealth is not going to provide the benefit that you expect. This is a counterintuitive universe the proverbist is describing. It's to use Christian terminology, a cruciform universe. How do you get your life? You lose your life. How do you find a treasury that will sustain you in your old age? You don't hoard, but you give away. It's a shocking piece of advice. It's a shocking teaching. That's what Jesus is illustrating in this parable, because this man is doing what would seem to be sensible. He's the beneficiary, he won the lottery, as it were, and his first thought is, the future no longer is problematic for me. I'm set for life. God intervenes, of course, in verse 20 and says, you fool, this very night your life will be demanded, and things you have prepared, whose will they be? And then, again, bringing us back to our proverb, so it is with those who store up treasures for themselves. These are our wicked treasures. They'll provide no benefit. You won't be able to take them with you. But not for those who are rich towards God. That is, those who funded a treasury through sharing their wealth with the poor. Clearly, that's what's presumed this man should have done when he struck it rich and had this incredible agricultural yield. The thing that should have gone off the light bulb in his head is not, now I'm set, but rather, how can I use this bounty, as it were, to assist and aid others? That would have funded the treasury that would have secured his future, but that's precisely what he doesn't do. All of that comes out of Proverbs 10:2, and it implies an incredible vertical dimension, because I think most of us would agree We don't want to save for the future simply by giving away our money. Most of us, including me, hedge our bets by having a retirement plan, etc. But the radicality of this proverb, certainly as understood within the Gospels, is there's a danger there. True wealth, Jesus wants to teach, is only going to be acquired by giving wealth away. Okay, so much for our proverb teaching, how to invest in the future. How do you do that? You give money away. So Peter Brown in his book, Eye of the Needle, talks about all these people who become converts to the church who give everything away, these rich Roman patrons and patronesses. The early church is full of stories of people who do this. And what motivates them to do that? It's teachings like this. This is what generates those actions. Now going on to Proverbs 19:17, we'll see this is going to be a similar set of issues, but slightly differently, we might want to say configured. Here, what we're going to see is an illustration, especially in how Ben Sira is going to build on our proverb, of how reciprocity works in the Bible. The way in which, according to biblical law, the poor were to be aided, individuals who fell poor because of poor agricultural yields or what have you, is that their kinsmen were obligated to loan them money. No interest loans, understanding being here that Lady Fortune is at work, and a bad crop failure can happen to anyone in any year. And so it's the obligation of those who don't suffer such a crop failure to help those who did. And reciprocity works on the grounds that, the wheel of fortune will turn in a subsequent year where my crops will fail. And if I have been giving to my neighbor to support them, when my crops fail, then I will be able to be supported by them. Ideally, that's how the world will work. And Ben Sira, in verses 1 to 7, is going to speak, especially verses 3 to 7, to that very idea, but also the very real pragmatic problems or challenges that emerge from that. So he's going to begin, he who lends to his neighbor acts mercifully. Whoever gives him a hand keeps the commandments. Lend to your neighbor in his time of need. And then the reverse, repay your neighbor if you're the one who's received the loan on time. Keep your word, be trustworthy with him, and on every occasion you'll find what you need. If you're, paying back in a generous fashion, timely fashion in the future, you will be able to secure loans because you'll have good credit, as it were, with your neighbors. There are many borrowers who seek a loan but then cause trouble for those who help them. Until he receives it, he kisses his hand and speaks in a humble way about his neighbor's wealth. But once he gets the money and time for repayment comes, he delays and repays with excuses. If he's able, that is, the person who loaned the money, he'll scarcely recoup half. But if not, the borrower has defrauded him of his wealth, and he, the lender, has acquired an enemy gratis. Curses and insults he will repay him, and instead of praise, he'll repay him with dishonor. And then the crucial point 7, because this is how people frequently work in light of their obligations to help their neighbor, many have turned away, not because they're wicked individuals, but because of people, defaulting on their loans. They're afraid of being defrauded for no reason. Okay, very important. Ben Sira is completely sober-minded here. Very important to bear this in mind when we're talking about helping just our average neighbor, right? When we come to verses 8 to 13, we're going to see Ben Sira changes his tone altogether. Verse 8, however, with the poor person be patient, do not keep him waiting for alms. For the sake of the commandment, help the poor according to his need. Do not turn him away empty-handed. Lose your money for a kinsman. And then verse 11, lay up your treasure. There we saw that in Tobit. Lay up your treasure according to the commandments, and it'll profit you more than gold. How do you lay up this treasure? You store up almsgiving in your treasury, and it will deliver you from every calamity. There's our proverb rephrased. More than a strong shield and a robust spear, it will fight for you against an enemy. So what's going on here in Ben Sira? Well, he's illustrating beautifully what is stated in a very pithy fashion, terse fashion in our proverb. Look at what our proverb says. He who is generous to the poor makes a loan to God, and God will surely repay him. So how does Ben Sira understand this? Well, I'm obligated to help my brother or sister in need, but my average, ordinary brother or sister who's not, impoverished, deeply impoverished, there are rational reasons for loaning, but there's also irrational reasons why, or rational reasons why I shouldn't loan. But Ben Sira, in our proverb, says, with the poor, a different set of rules kick in. God now is the guarantor of that loan, and if the poor person doesn't repay, God will be the individual who will repay. There's our vertical axis, right? This is how Ben Sira, kind of shakes us out of our materialistic doldrums, that when we enter into the practice of charity, we're leaving Wall Street, right? We're not acting according to the conventional rules of how money circulates in an economy. And why is that? Because for these writers, God stands behind all of this. We're entering into an action that is stamped with the very character of God. And if we turn then to our Jewish Midrash, text number 6, and then our patristic counterpart, text number 7, we'll see how early Jews and early Christians made use of this. What's really amazing to me, these texts aren't related to one another. Our rabbis didn't read St. Basil, and St. Basil doesn't read the rabbis, but they both make almost exactly the same homiletical point, which shows you how deep this biblical material had sunk into the foundations of church and synagogue, that independently it produces theological expositions that are extraordinarily similar. So a certain philosopher asked a question of Rabbi Gamliel. He said to him, it's written in your Torah. This is a Roman thinker, Greco-Roman thinker, obviously not one sympathetic to what the Jewish Bible teaches. It's written in your Torah, the book of Deuteronomy, give to your needy kinsman readily and have no regrets, worries, second thoughts, whatever, when you do so. And then he asked, do you have such a man that can give away his property to others without entertaining the worry that he will eventually need help himself? In other words, he'll never be repaid back. He'll be a pauper. He'll be in the same predicament as the other poor men. And listen to what Rabbi Gamaliel says. He replied to him, if a man comes to borrow from you, would you give him a loan? That is, someone just out of nowhere asks you for money. He replied, no. Well, if he brought a deposit, would you give him a loan? He replied, yes. Our whole banking system depends on that, right? If he brought you someone that was not quite fitting to stand surety, basically meaning a cosigner for a loan, would you give him the loan? No. Well, if he brought you as surety, the cosigner is the head of the province, would you give him a loan? Well, of course. That takes all the risk out of it altogether, right? Well then, is not the matter a piece of a fortiori logic? If when an ordinary mortal will go surety for him, you will issue the loan. But how much more so when he who spoke and made the world go surety for him? For Scripture says, he who is generous to the poor makes a loan to God, and God will repay him. And then St. Basil, 4th century, Cappadocian, basically the middle of modern Turkey. Listen, you rich men, to what we advise the poor because of your inhumanity, rather to persevere in their terrible situation than to accept the misfortunes which come from the payment of interest. But if you obey the Lord, what need is there of these words? What is the counsel of the master? Lend to those from whom you do not hope to receive in return. And what sort of loan is this, to which there is no hope of a return? Consider the force of the statement, and you admire the kindness of the lawmaker. Whenever you have the intention of providing for a poor man for the Lord's sake, the same thing is both a gift and a loan because of the great gift of the master who pays in his place, and who, receiving trifling things through a poor man will give great things in return. What's the proof that God works this way? Proverbs 19. He that hath mercy on the poor lends to God. Do you not wish to have the Lord of the universe answerable to you for payment? Or if one of the rich men in the city would promise you payment for others, would you accept his pledge? But you don't accept God as surety for the poor? Give the money, since it's lying idle, without weighing it down with additional charges, and it will be good for both of you. Both the recipient, of course, receives money he needs to live his life, but the donor as well. There will be for you the assurance of its safety because of his custody, for him receiving it, the advantage from its use. And if you're seeking additional payment, be satisfied with that from the Lord. He himself will pay interest for the poor. Expect kindly acts from him who is truly kind. Now, the last text we won't read for the purposes of time, but it comes from Leo the Great. It's a fantastic text and illustrates a kind of wordplay that only works in Latin. But I remember I was writing my book on sin, which was a complement to my book on charity, over in the Weston Library. And in my downtime, when I got tired, I just pulled out, a German Bible, and I was reading in Samuel just to keep my German up to in shape. And I was reading this section in Samuel where David accrues to himself all these, basically lowlifes while he's fleeing from Saul. And in one of the lines in German, it says that all of these Gläubiger is a German term, believers came to associate themselves with David. And I thought, oh my God, that can't be right. But, Glauben, that's one of the first words you learn in German. I thought, I must have this wrong. I'm going to have to get a German dictionary and find there must be a meaning to the word Glauben that I don't know. And bear in mind, this was 2008, I think, which is when we had the great credit crisis as well. So all of these things were bubbling in my mind. I remember one day listening to NPR, they said, well, you wouldn't know if when you woke up on Monday if your credit cards would work when you went to buy gas because of the credit crisis, the belief crisis. Would the credit card companies believe they would get their money back? If they didn't believe it, your cards are worthless. And it was kind of shocking to me. Anyway, so I look up the German Gläubiger, and it means creditor. And then it was like, bingo, well, what's creditor in English? But it comes from the Latin credere, to believe. Well, who is a creditor? A creditor is someone who believes that when he loans money, he's going to get his money back, right? So I had to read German to figure out the Latin meaning of an English word. And then, boom, it's like my head exploded in the library. Like I could have lifted off from my chair. All kinds of things then became clear in this material from this just, odd habit of reading Samuel in German. But it informs here what Leo says. He uses this word credere in an incredibly brilliant fashion, believing in God, credere in God, or believing in, your fellow man, homini, when you give him a charitable gift. And you prove your belief not by your words, but by what you do. Do you, in your words, enact what you believe? A creditor only becomes worthy of that title when he loans you the money. And for Leo, the same thing. A creditor, someone who believes in the gospel, who believes the creed, only becomes worthy of the words of the creed when he enacts it in his life. How do you enact it in your life? By giving money to the poor. All of which should make clear that when we get here to text 9, why this material was so important in early Christianity and why Peter Brown devoted literally hundreds of pages to expositing on its significance. Okay, I hope I've provided an answer to the question I posed at the beginning of my lecture. The reason that Scripture attaches a reward to charity is not simply to motivate the potential donor. There's an element of that. But I think more importantly and more profoundly, that language of reward is there to make a statement about the character of the world God made and the character of the God who providentially guides the world. What kind of stuff is the world made out of, And in light of that, how might I best act to profit from the world in which I find myself? Now, all analogies here limp, but let me try to explain in one other way. My wife, here, beautiful wife in the back of the room, she can vouch for the truth of this story, was once in charge of a swimming class for adults when we lived in Durham, North Carolina, that included a number of individuals who had near drowning experiences in their younger years. This naturally led to an extraordinary fear of water. Now, anyone who's done a proper investigations of the physics of water knows that most human bodies are naturally buoyant enough to float near its surface. But in order to exploit this fact, you have to be relaxed, and in turn, you must trust the capacity of water to hold your body afloat. The more you fear the water, the more you'll tense up. The more you tense up, you will thrash about, and the result, it will be very difficult to come up for air. Because the students my wife taught had been conditioned to fear the water, it was very difficult to trust its natural buoyant capacity. They could grasp the physics of the situation on land without any problem, but entering the water brought a whole host of demons to the fore. Knowing something and acting on that knowledge, I'm sure as all of you know in this room, are two very different things. And so we might say for the treasury in heaven, what stands behind this idea is a claim about the nature of the world. To the casual observer, the world, like the middle of Lake Michigan, I'm from the Midwest, you probably want to think the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, but Lake Michigan looks like the Atlantic Ocean, trust me. The middle of Lake Michigan can be a frightening and unstable place. There is a reason that the Greeks and Romans revered the goddesses Tyche and Fortuna, but at the same time, there's a deep desire to affirm that the world was made out of charity. And that's why Jesus promises the rich young man a treasury in heaven. The point of the promise can't be limited to motivation. Its function lies elsewhere. Behind it is the claim that in the long run, mercy wins. Why? Because this is the type of world God made. This is the type of world, or the type of God, who guides that world by his providence. Charity, I am suggesting, is not simply about making things better on earth, but it also reveals something about the essential shape of the world God has made and how one might flourish in it. I often like to say that early Christian teaching about charity is more metaphysical than moral. It's definitely moral, but the moral rides like a caboose behind the metaphysical. And I think the modern problem is that the metaphysical is gone and we only have the moral. And I think that puts the moral on, unfortunately, uncertain footing. Some may be uneasy here and fear that I'm prioritizing a momentary feeling of pity for the downtrodden over a substantial and far-reaching concern for constructing a more just society in which the need for alms would disappear. Though such fears are commendable, acts of kindness, no matter how virtuous, certainly don't compensate for deep structural evils. In the end, however, this perspective, I think, misses a crucial ingredient. For the deeper question to be asked, I think, is what funds our thirst for social justice in the first place? And from whence comes this obligation to help the poor? That Tannaitic midrash is very revealing in that sense. This Greco-Roman thinker couldn't conceive of why the Jews, and by extension the Christians, acted the way they did. It seemed illogical, right? Illogical. The Greco-Roman thinker thought of money as circulating the way in which any Wall Street broker thinks about it. So the concern for the poor for Greco-Roman thinkers was by no means a high value. Reciprocity was imagined within the circle of people you could trust. But the church and synagogue invert this. The true reciprocity is enacted with people who can't repay. It's completely illogical. And that's where the concern for the poor in Western culture emerges. Peter Brown talks about the church inventing the poor. They weren't a class of people that existed as an element for which the governing body had any special concern. That comes out of these practices. Western culture is heir to that, even if Western culture doesn't recognize or concede its religious foundation. It wasn't a virtue, I say, in Greco-Roman culture, nor is it always esteemed by present-day libertarians, a philosophy that is alarmingly popular among the young. Do we have any guarantee that a concern for the poor will remain a commitment of Western culture once Christianity has fully receded into the background? The sociologist Christian Smith has recently argued that the concern for the poor, so prominent in Western democracies, has its origins in biblical religion. Peter Brown's recent book has provided massive documentation of the truth of this claim. Though modern thinkers such as Immanuel Kant and John Rawls have made arguments for why secular societies should retain their values, their arguments, Smith contends, often presuppose the moral virtues they wish to justify. This raises an alarming possibility. Absent the Bible's metaphysical claims, will such moral actions continue? Of course, that's possible, but Christian Smith suggests a darker possibility. He writes, sociological understanding suggests that beliefs and ideas require institutional resources to sustain. Values, categories, norms, and viewpoints do not operate like perpetual motion machines. Entropy is always at work. Alternative values, categories, norms, and viewpoints are always competing for adherence. In order for belief commitments, especially challenging and costly commitments, to endure over time and space, they must benefit from institutionalized resources and customs to reinforce and validate them. Time and again in the historical record of cultural change, belief and values once prized have come to seem outmoded, irrelevant, passé, not worthy of allegiance. Just think about assisted suicide in Canada now. A father who's 95, and I'm glad he lives in this country. I wouldn't want assisted suicide to be presented to him by his doctor as, a concern or an issue that he can consider. Also have a severely handicapped son for whom also in Canada this option is offered. And I'm very glad that I live in the United States where doctors aren't suggesting this option to them as well. 30 years ago, no one would have ever imagined that something like this could have surfaced. But, it did. And how will we recreate the values that informed another universe? That's no easy thing. For this reason, Smith concludes, I suggest it's worth our reconsidering the necessary metaphysical and cultural bases of the moral facts and obligations to which we are committed now, while they are still understood and practiced. Well, this afternoon, with the help of your handout, we've considered the metaphysical basis that grounds the church's and synagogues' approach to charity. As I have argued, that basis consists in the belief that God created and providentially guides the world he created by love, the last line in Dante's Divine Comedy. Not just an empty line that sounds nice and you put it on a poster in your dorm room or office, but for Dante, a metaphysical claim about the world that should orient how you will act in order to flourish in that world. Personally, I find this a deeply attractive posture to adopt as one makes one's way through life. I can understand why some might find it hard to believe. Teaching of Proverbs 10 or Proverbs 19 is pretty demanding, and there are a lot of reasons why one might be suspicious. But I don't understand why everyone wouldn't pray that the teachings like this are true and that they could organize their lives around them. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We're going to be using this one microphone here, so I'll ask the questions and then let you. how does the Christian concept of a treasury relate to the theology of merit and grace, and especially in light of the Reformation and the Council of Trent? You can take that as far as you want to take it.
Oh my God. That would be a whole nother lecture, but certainly one of the reasons why this concept has become so problematic is the treasury of the treasury in heaven becomes the treasury of merits in medieval Catholicism, which informs the entire understanding of purgatory and how one will avoid eternal perdition. And that's why one of the reasons why this is such a neuralgic point. But I think it would be unfair to say this is just Protestant Catholic, because as Peter Brown I think nicely illustrates, Catholic dictionaries and Catholic thinkers as well have an aversion to this. In a sense, we're all Protestants now. It's the atmosphere of modernity, and that's a fantastic question. But I'm going to limit myself to that because I could go on for another hour, and I'm sure you don't want me to do that.
What is the relation of the virtue of charity and the virtue of poverty itself? This may be a question a bit from a Franciscan direction. Giving wealth accumulates treasure in heaven. Is the merit acquired subsequently, not in the giving, but in the cheerful endurance of poverty?
I tend to separate the two things, but I can see why you've drawn them together. I think the reason why poverty is a virtue is that it represents absolute dependence on God. So some people think Proverbs 10 is unbelievable, but let me tell that you give your money away and, riches, you'll be repaid infinitely. It's an otherworldly return to be sure. But let me give you just two pedestrian illustrations of it, and then a third point that will tie this back specifically to the question. I can remember being in the Metropolitan Museum in New York in the 90s. I was looking at an exhibit of Assisi after the earthquake. I don't remember when the earthquake happened, but it damaged the church tremendously, and there was a huge effort to reconstruct it, which they did. But in what the museum put on the little inscription next to the exhibit was that said that Francis's body wasn't even cold in his grave, and kings from all over Europe were sending money beyond counting to build this basilica. And tie that to Mother Teresa. She had many individuals who wanted to endow her mission in order that she could be even more charitable. She refused endowment monies. Francis, of course, famously didn't want money either, but people love holiness. And people want to endow holiness. It just speaks of itself. And what is holiness both for Mother Teresa and for St. Francis? It was to give away everything and be wholly dependent on God. That's why she didn't want an endowment. She felt that would compromise the mission's purpose. There's also a similar story told about one of the great Hasidic masters of the 17th or 18th century, the Baal Shem Tov, Besht as he is known in Judaism. It's hard to know if this is true because he didn't leave any writings. Everything is from his students. But at least one of the students said that every night before he would go to sleep, he would empty his pockets to the poor so he could wake up the next morning totally dependent on God. So I think that definitely is the theological virtue of relying on God. In that sense, the two are related. But I also, invoke the story certainly of, the Besht, the Baal Shem Tov reflects, I think, the thinking both of Mother Teresa and St. Francis of Assisi, that when one acts a radical charity like that, you enter a parallel universe. And different, economic rules, kick into play. And you certainly can see that that was true for both of them.
Perhaps one more question, given the time. What about charity begins at home? One thing is you give away all of your own wealth, but what about the people who depend on you? You're giving away their wealth as well. Didn't seem to be too much of a concern for Tobit's father, But what about Charity Begins at Home?
So actually, it did in that citation from Tobit, if you go back and look, he says, make your gift for them in proportion. So that element is there. Tobit still is a radical giver, but this isn't a talk on Tobit, so I won't go into the way in which his radicalness is played out, but there are different ways of playing this out. But certainly that's true. I think people that have families have to measure the needs of their family over against what the gospel demands of them. People will often ask me at the end of the lecture, well, how much should I give? And I would never want to answer such a question. Tithing is great. Well, tithing would be great because most people don't give that much. Here's where evangelical Protestants, are way more virtuous than most Catholics because they do tithe. But I don't like that either. I think the teaching of the gospel is that we do have to give everything, but how you give everything, has to be determined by your personal circumstance. And I think that's something between an individual and their spiritual director, their prayer life, whatever. What does it mean in my life concretely to give everything? I don't like tithing because it seems like, well, I've given my 10%, then I can take the other 90% and go to Bermuda and whatever. I can just, enjoy it, and who cares what happens? And I don't know, that doesn't seem right to me.
All right, well, thank you so much. And just very quickly, I want to mention that the Harvard Catholic Forum's events continue a week from tonight, Thursday, October 19th, the next in our Conversations with Catholic Scholars and Scientists series, featuring the remarkable Dr. Thomas Hayne from Mass General and Harvard Medical School. Pick up one of the brochures on the table by the door. I think it's right out there on the next to where the food is, or check out harvardcatholicforum.org to register. And again, please help us by filling out the 2-minute survey and dropping it in the box as you leave, or for our Zoom viewers, doing the quick survey that you will get shortly. And everyone here in the hall, please join us for some food and drink and fellowship. Thank you all, and have a good evening.